It all began the night the stars stopped blinking and something greater began to watch. Thomas Crow had never been a man of many words. At 52, he understood the weight of silence better than most. His farm sat 15 miles from the nearest town, a place called Redemption Falls, in the Wyoming backcountry. It was one of those localities that appeared on maps only as a dot, with nothing much to tell beyond a Baptist church, a gas station, and memories nobody bothered to recall anymore. Thomas's life was made of routine. Wake before dawn, feed the horses, check the fences, fix what time insisted on breaking. His wife, Mary, had passed 3 years earlier. Leukemia, the doctors said. Since then, the farm seemed larger, the silence heavier, and the nights infinitely longer. That October evening, Thomas had finished his chores earlier than usual. The sky was clear, cloudless, and the air had that cold, sharp quality typical of autumn in the mountains. He sat on the porch with a cup of lukewarm coffee, watching the horizon where mountains met sky. It was his ritual, his moment to pretend Mary was still inside the house, preparing dinner. But then something changed. First, it was the silence, not the ordinary silence of a country night. That one punctuated by crickets, wind in the trees, the occasional distant bark of a dog. This was absolute silence, as if the world had held its breath. Thomas stood slowly, feeling a shiver climb up his spine. The horses in the stable had stopped moving. Not even the wind was blowing. That's when he saw the light. It wasn't like car headlights or the full moon. It was something different, a soft, pulsing luminosity that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at the same time. It emanated from behind the old barn, the one Thomas rarely used since the roof began to give way 2 winters ago. His first instinct was to grab the shotgun, but something stopped him. Perhaps it was curiosity. Perhaps it was the fact that in that impossible silence, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. A presence. Not threatening, just present. Thomas walked toward the barn with slow, cautious steps. The light grew more intense as he approached, but strangely didn't hurt his eyes. It was warm without burning, bright without blinding. When he opened the creaking barn door, what he saw made him freeze in place. There was someone, in the center of the empty space. The figure was humanoid, but not human. It stood about 7 feet tall, with long limbs and proportions that defied conventional anatomy. Its skin, if it could be called that, seemed to reflect its own light, as if made of something between flesh and star. There were no visible clothes, but there was also no nudity. It was as if the concept of clothing simply didn't apply. The eyes were large, dark, but not empty. There was depth in them, intelligence, and something more. Something Thomas could only describe later as compassion. The being didn't move. It merely observed Thomas with those immense, calm eyes. And Thomas, against all his instincts, didn't flee. He stood there at the barn door, breathing heavily, trying to process the impossible. What are you?" Thomas whispered, though he knew the question was futile. But then something extraordinary happened. The being didn't speak, not with words at least. But Thomas heard, not with his ears, but with something much deeper. It was as if thoughts that weren't his emerged in his mind, complete and crystalline. "Do not be afraid." Simple as that. 3 words that carried more weight and certainty than anything Thomas had ever heard. And strangely, the fear began to fade. Not completely. There was still the shock, the disbelief, the sensation that reality had cracked in half. But the primitive terror that should have been consuming him wasn't there. Thomas took a step into the barn, then another. The being remained motionless, but its luminosity pulsed slightly, as if acknowledging the approach. Did you come from the sky?" Thomas asked, his voice still trembling. "I came from where all things come, from where all things return." The answer was enigmatic, but Thomas felt there was truth in it. He pulled over an old crate and sat down, his legs suddenly weak. His mind raced in circles, trying to fit what he was seeing into some logical framework. Alien. It had to be an alien. But then, why didn't he feel fear? Why did he feel peace? "Why are you here?" Thomas asked after a long silence. "Why my farm? Why me?" The being tilted its head slightly, an almost human gesture that seemed out of place in that impossible form. "Because you stopped asking questions a long time ago. Because you carry a void that calls out. And because time is running out. Time for what? For choices. For awakening. for understanding. Thomas ran his hand over his face. Part of him still believed he was dreaming. Maybe he had fallen asleep on the porch, and this was just the result of exhaustion and loneliness. But the texture of the air, the sensation of palpable reality, everything seemed too real to be fantasy. "I don't understand any of this," Thomas admitted. "I don't understand what you are, why you're here, or what you expect from me." "I expect nothing. I merely offer." "Offer what?" "Truth." The word echoed in his mind like a bell, and Thomas, in that moment, realized he wanted to listen. Despite the absurdity of the situation, despite everything his life had been up to that point, he wanted to know, needed to know. "Speak," he said simply, and the being began, not with words but with images, sensation, understandings that emerged complete in his mind. Thomas saw things he had no vocabulary to describe. He saw the universe not as empty space dotted by stars, but as a living, pulsating, conscious organism. He saw that what they called life was not Earth's privilege, but the fundamental rule of all existence. He saw that consciousness was not an evolutionary accident, but the very substance of reality. And then he saw something more specific, something that made his heart race. He saw an object, no, a being, traveling through space. It was immense, ancient, and carried within it billions of presences. They weren't physical bodies, but consciousnesses, souls. And this object had a name Thomas vaguely recognized from the news: 3I Atlas. Scientists had discovered that interstellar comet years before, tracking its trajectory through the solar system. But what telescopes and instruments couldn't see was what it really was. 3I Atlas wasn't just rock and cosmic ice. It was an ark, a vehicle, a container carrying those who had chosen to depart before the transformation arrived. Thomas saw that humanity stood on the brink of something monumental, a fundamental shift in the very structure of reality. Some called it ascension, others rapture, still others end times. But all these names were merely human attempts to describe the indescribable. What was coming wasn't destruction, it was metamorphosis. Just as the caterpillar must completely dissolve to become a butterfly, came the being's thought: humanity must undergo its own transformation process. Those who resist, who cling to the cocoon, will remain where they are. Those who allow themselves to dissolve will emerge as something new. "And Jesus?" Thomas asked suddenly, surprising himself with his own question. He wasn't particularly religious. He went to church when Mary was alive because she liked it. But now, before this being, the name rose to his lips almost involuntarily. The being remained silent for a long moment. Then a sensation of profound reverence filled the space between them. What you call Jesus was a precursor, one who went through the process completely and returned to show the way. He was not different from you. He was what all of you can become. The resurrection was not a miracle, and it was a demonstration. The ascension was not a departure, it was an arrival. Thomas felt tears streaming down his face without knowing exactly why. It wasn't sadness, it was something greater, an understanding that his intellect couldn't completely process, but that his heart accepted without question. "And 3I Atlas?" he asked. "What's inside it that's so terrifying?" "It is not terrifying, it is choice." Those who don't feel ready for transformation, who fear dissolving, were gathered. They will travel until they are prepared, until they learn that the death of the self is the birth of the self, until they understand that losing everything is the only path to gaining what truly matters. So they weren't abandoned? No one is abandoned, only rescheduled. Thomas laughed, a strange, half-hysterical sound in that absurd moment. But it was a laugh of relief, of understanding. For 3 years since Mary departed, he had carried anger at God if God existed, anger at the universe for being so cruel, anger at himself for not being able to save her. But now, in that barn illuminated by a light that shouldn't exist, conversing with a being that defied all logic, Thomas finally understood. Mary hadn't been taken from him. She had merely crossed over first, and perhaps, just perhaps, she was waiting on the other side. "How can I know this is real?" Thomas whispered. "How do I know I'm not going insane?" The being extended something resembling a hand. It was delicate, with long fingers that glowed softly. Thomas hesitated only for a second before extending his own hand. When they touched, The world exploded. Thomas saw everything at once. He saw the birth of stars and their death. He saw civilizations rising and falling on planets whose names he would never know. He saw the web of connections linking all conscious life in the universe, a network of golden light, pulsing with unconditional love. He saw that he had never been alone, that none of us were. That loneliness was merely the necessary illusion so we could experience the miracle of reunion. And then, at the center of everything, he saw a face. Mary. She was different, younger, more radiant, but unmistakably her. And she smiled at him with that smile he had loved for 27 years. She said nothing, but Thomas felt the message nonetheless. Wait a little longer. Finish what needs to be finished, but know that I am here. And when it's your time, I'll be waiting. When the touch broke, Thomas was on his knees on the barn floor, sobbing, not from pain, but from gratitude, from joy, from a completeness he didn't know was possible to feel. The being withdrew gently, giving him space. "How long will you stay?" Thomas asked when he finally recovered his voice. 3 days. After that, I must leave. There are others who need to hear. Thomas nodded. 3 days. 72 hours with an angel, or alien, or messenger, or whatever it was, hidden in his barn. He should tell someone, should call the authorities, the press, someone. But he knew he wouldn't do that. Some truths couldn't be shared, only lived. The first night, Thomas didn't sleep. He brought blankets and a thermos of coffee to the barn, settling into the old rocking chair his grandfather had built decades ago. The being remained in the center of the space, luminous and still, like a statue carved from moonlight. Thomas watched, occasionally asking questions that the being would answer not with words, but with knowings that appeared whole in his mind. He learned that time was not what he thought it was, that past, present, and future existed simultaneously, and that what humans experienced as linear progression was merely a limitation of perception. He learned that death was not an ending, but a transition, like walking from one room into another. The fear of it, the being explained, was simply the fear of the unknown doorway, not what lay beyond. "You have died countless times before this life," the thought came, "and you will live countless times after. But each life is unique, each moment irreplaceable. That is the gift and the terror of incarnation." "Then what's the point?" Thomas asked. "If we keep coming back, if nothing really ends, what's the purpose of all this suffering?" The being's luminosity pulsed, and Thomas felt something like sadness emanate from it. "Suffering is not the point. Growth is. You incarnate not to suffer, but to learn, to experience, to expand. Suffering happens when you resist what is, when you cling to what was, when you fear what will be." Thomas thought of Mary, of how he had spent 3 years resisting her absence, clinging to memories, fearing a future without her. And in that resistance, he had created his own prison. "So I've been doing it wrong," he said quietly. "There is no wrong, only paths, some longer, some shorter, but all leading to the same destination." "And what destination is that?" "Home." The word settled in Thomas's chest like a warm coal. Home, not a place, but a state of being, a return to something he had forgotten, but never truly lost. As dawn approached, Thomas finally dozed off in the rocking chair. When he woke a few hours later, sunlight was streaming through the gaps in the barn walls, and the being was still there, unchained, patient. Thomas realized with a start that he needed to maintain his normal routine. If anyone came by and found him spending all his time in the barn, questions would be asked. He went through the motions of his day, feeding the horses, checking the water troughs, fixing a section of fence that had come loose. But everything felt different now. The colors seemed brighter, the air more alive. Even the simple act of hammering a nail felt profound, as if he were participating in some cosmic dance of creation and maintenance. His neighbor, Bill Patterson, stopped by around noon with some mail that had been misdelivered. Bill was a good man, a retired veteran who lived alone since his divorce. They usually exchanged pleasantries, maybe talked about weather or cattle prices. But today, as Bill stood there talking about a storm system moving in, Thomas really looked at him, and what he saw broke his heart. He saw the loneliness Bill carried like a second skin, the quiet desperation of a man who had lost his sense of purpose. The way his eyes never quite met Thomas's, as if afraid of being truly seen. "Bill," Thomas said suddenly, interrupting a comment about barometric pressure. "You doing okay? I mean, really okay?" Bill blinked, caught off guard. Yeah, sure. Why do you ask? Just seems like we've been neighbors for 15 years and I've never really asked." Something shifted in Bill's expression. His shoulders sagged slightly, as if a weight he'd been holding suddenly felt heavier for being acknowledged. "Honestly, some days are harder than others. The house gets pretty quiet, you know." Thomas nodded. "I know, but you don't have to carry it alone. Come by for coffee sometime, or if you just need someone to talk to." Bill's eyes glistened. "I might take you up on that, Thomas. I appreciate it." After Bill left, Thomas stood on his porch, shaken. He had lived next to that man for 15 years and never truly seen him, never offered more than surface-level conversation. How many others had he passed through life without really seeing? That night, when he returned to the barn, he told the being what had happened. "You are beginning to wake up," came the response. "To see with more than eyes. This is what the transformation does. It removes the veil between souls." Is this what Jesus saw when he looked at people? Yes, he saw the divine in everyone, the light obscured by layers of pain and forgetting. That is why he could love so completely, why he could forgive so easily. He saw the truth that others could not. Thomas leaned back in the rocking chair. "I always thought being Christian meant following rules, going to church, believing the right things. Belief is the smallest part. It is the shield humans use to avoid the real work. It is easier to say, 'I believe,' than to actually become what you claim to believe in." Jesus did not ask for belief. He asked for transformation. "Follow me, not worship me." There is a difference. But people say he's the only way to salvation. He is a way. The way he demonstrated was one of complete surrender to love, of dying to the false self and being reborn in truth. There are many paths up the mountain, but the summit is the same. Some call it Christ consciousness, some call it enlightenment, some call it union with God. The names differ. The destination does not. Thomas sat with that for a long time. It was both simpler and more complex than anything he'd been taught. Not about being saved by belief, but by transformation. Not about what you professed, but what you became. The second day brought a test. Thomas was in town picking up supplies when he ran into someone he hadn't seen in over a year. Derek Morrison, Mary's brother. Their relationship had been strained since the funeral. Derek had said things, bitter things, about how Thomas should have gotten Mary to different doctors, should have tried experimental treatments, should have done more. The words had created a chasm between them that neither had attempted to bridge. Derek saw him across the hardware store and froze. For a moment, Thomas felt the old anger rise in his chest, the defensive fury at accusations he'd already hurled at himself 1,000 times. But then, he paused. He looked at Derek, not with the eyes of someone wounded, but with something deeper, and he saw what he hadn't seen before. Derek's anger wasn't really about Thomas. It was about his own helplessness. His own guilt at not being there more for his sister. His own inability to accept that sometimes, despite everything, people die. The anger was just grief in a different costume. Thomas walked over. Derek's body tensed, preparing for conflict or retreat. "Derek," Thomas said quietly, "I've missed you." Those 4 words did what months of avoidance couldn't. Derek's face crumpled. "I'm sorry, Thomas. God, I'm so sorry. The things I said, you were hurting. I understand. I blamed you because I couldn't handle blaming myself, or her, or God, or whoever decides these things. I know. I did the same thing." They stood there in the middle of the hardware store, 2 middle-aged men with tears in their eyes, and something old and poisonous dissolved between them. They talked for over an hour, sitting in Thomas's truck in the parking lot. Real talk, the kind that excavates truth instead of burying it. When Thomas finally drove home, he felt lighter, as if he'd been carrying Derek's pain along with his own, and the simple act of forgiveness had freed them both. That night, he told the being about it. "This is the work," came the response. "Not grand gestures or miracles, but these small transformations, these moments where you choose love over fear, connection over separation. This is how the world changes, one healed relationship at a time." But what about Three Eye Atlas? What about the transformation you talked about? When is that coming? It is already here. It began the moment you stopped running from truth. Every person who wakes up accelerates it. Every act of genuine love strengthens it. The question is not when it will arrive, but whether you will participate. And those on the comet, the ones who weren't ready, they chose what they needed. Some souls require more time, more experiences. There is no judgment in this, only compassion. They will return when they are ready. Perhaps in this cycle, perhaps in another, but they will return. Thomas thought about that. An entire arc of souls traveling through space, having their own experiences, their own lessons. It was both humbling and beautiful. Why don't more people know about this? Why isn't everyone talking about it? Because most are not ready to hear, and those who are ready find their way. You think it is accident that I appeared to you? That Bill stopped by today? That you ran into Derek? There are no accidents, only synchronicities that people either notice or ignore. On the third day, Thomas woke with a heaviness in his chest. The being would leave tonight. This window of understanding, of clarity, would close. He would return to being just Thomas Crow, an ordinary man on an ordinary farm. Or would he? He spent the day doing something he hadn't done in 3 years. He went through Mary's thing, not to pack them away, but to remember with joy instead of pain. He found her journals, filled with her neat handwriting, recipes she'd collected, pressed flowers, little notes she'd written to herself. One note made him stop. Remind Thomas that love doesn't end. It transforms. She had written that 6 months before she died, as if she'd known, as if she'd been preparing him for what he wasn't ready to accept. He sat on their bed, his bed now, and cried. But they weren't tears of grief. They were tears of gratitude for having known her, for the time they'd shared, for the love that, he now understood, hadn't ended at all. It had merely changed form. That evening, he brought something to the barn he hadn't touched in years, his guitar. Mary had loved when he played. He'd stopped after she died, unable to bear the memories it triggered. But now, he sat in the rocking chair and played. Old hymns, mostly. Amazing Grace. It is well with my soul. The chords came back slowly, his fingers remembering what his mind had tried to forget. The being listened, its luminosity pulsing in time with the music. When Thomas finished, he set the guitar aside. I think I understand now, he said, what you came to teach me. Tell me, it's not about knowledge. It's not about beliefs or doctrines or being right. It's about staying open, about choosing love even when fear seems smarter, about seeing the divine in everything, even suffering, especially suffering. Yes, and Three-Eye Atlas, it's not something to fear. It's just one path among many, a symbol of what happens when we're not ready to let go, when we need more time to learn what you've been teaching me. Yes, the transformation isn't coming. It's always been here. We just have to open our eyes to it. Yes, Thomas felt tears streaming down his face again. I don't want you to go. I am not going. I am simply becoming invisible again. But I have always been here. In every sunset you stopped to watch. In every kindness you witnessed, in every moment of love you experienced. I am not separate from you, Thomas. I never was. Then what are you? I am what you might become, what all humans might become, a consciousness unbound by fear, by separation, by the illusion of death. I am the reminder of what you forgot when you were born, that you are not a body having a spiritual experience, but a spirit having a bodily experience. The being's light began to intensify, growing brighter and brighter until Thomas had to shield his eyes. He felt warmth enveloping him, like being embraced by the sun itself. And in that warmth, he heard a final message. Tell others not through words, but through being. Let your life be the message. And know this, Thomas Crow, you are loved beyond measure. You always have been. You always will be. Then the light collapsed inward, becoming a single point of brilliance that hung in the air for 1 heartbeat, 2, 3, and then vanished. Thomas sat in the darkness of the barn, the only illumination now coming from his old lantern. But he wasn't alone. He could feel it. The presence hadn't left. It had simply integrated, become part of the air he breathed, the ground beneath him, the beating of his own heart. He stood slowly, his body stiff from hours of sitting. He walked out of the barn into the night. The stars were brilliant overhead, and for the first time, he didn't see them as distant objects. He saw them as companions, as other consciousnesses, other expressions of the same universal love that had just touched him. In the distance, he could see the lights of Bill's house. Tomorrow, he would make good on his invitation. He would reach out. He would connect, not because he had to, but because he finally understood that separation was the only true hell, and that every bridge built between souls was a small act of salvation. He thought about Three-Eye Atlas, somewhere out there in the vast darkness, carrying its cargo of not-yet-ready souls. He sent them love, not pity, but genuine compassion. They were doing their work, just as he was doing his. Different paths, same mountain, and he thought about Mary, waiting somewhere beyond the veil, not lost to him, but present in a new way. In every act of love he performed, in every moment of grace he allowed himself to receive. She wasn't gone. She had just graduated to a new classroom while he finished his lessons in this one. Thomas Crow returned to his house that night, a different man than he'd been 3 days before. Not because he'd met an alien, not because he'd received cosmic secrets, but because he'd finally stopped running from the one truth that mattered. Love was the answer. It always had been. Everything else was just detail. 3 months later, Redemption Falls had changed in small but significant ways. Bill Patterson was coming over for coffee twice a week, and the two men had formed a genuine friendship. Derek Morrison visited monthly, helping Thomas with projects around the farm. The local church had a new volunteer, Thomas himself, though he never spoke about what had happened in his barn. He didn't need to. His presence, his way of being, spoke louder than words ever could. People noticed something different about him, a peace that wasn't explained by circumstances, a kindness that seemed to flow naturally rather than from obligation. When asked, he would simply smile and say, "I guess I finally figured out what matters." At night, sometimes, he would sit on his porch and look up at the stars, and though he never saw the light again, he would sometimes feel a familiar warmth, a reminder, a whisper that sounded like truth. You are not alone. You never were. And Thomas, who had once been a man of few words, began to find his voice, not in preaching or proselytizing, but in simple conversations, in listening deeply, in seeing people truly, in being present for the small moments that, he now understood, were actually the largest moments of all. The world continued its transformation, invisible to those who weren't ready to see. But for those who were, the signs were everywhere, in random acts of kindness, in moments of forgiveness, in the slow, steady awakening of souls who finally remembered what they'd always known. That love was the fabric of reality, that separation was illusion, that death was not an ending, but a doorway, and that somewhere out there, carried by a comet named Three-Eye Atlas, other souls were learning these lessons in their own way, in their own time. Thomas never spoke publicly about what happened in his barn. Some truths, he learned, could not be transmitted through words. They had to be lived, embodied, shared through the quiet revolution of a single life transformed. But late at night, when the world was quiet and the veil between worlds grew thin, he would remember. And in remembering, he would smile, because he knew a secret that fear tried hard to hide. The universe was not a cold, empty place. It was teeming with consciousness, with love, with beings that understood what humanity was still learning, that we are all one, that we are all going home, and that the journey, with all its pain and beauty, was exactly what we needed. Perhaps he wondered sometimes if the being had been real, if those 3 days had truly happened, or if they were the product of grief and loneliness manifesting in his desperate mind. But then he would touch the lives he'd changed. He would feel the peace that no longer left him. He would remember Mary's face in that cosmic vision, smiling and waiting, and he would know. Some truths don't need proof. They need only to be felt. The stars above Redemption Falls continued their ancient dance, carrying secrets that few were ready to understand. But for those who were, for those who allowed themselves to dissolve and be remade, the universe whispered its ancient promise. You are seen, you are loved, and when your metamorphosis is complete, you will understand that you were never a caterpillar at all. You were always the butterfly, dreaming you had to learn to fly. Truth or fiction? Perhaps not even the storyteller knows. Here, stories exist to touch and make you reflect. The magical reveals itself only to those who allow themselves to feel, not to those who insist on seeking certainties.